peak oil is a giant short bet on human ingenuity, and that's just a sucker's bet. This revolution in shale has actually changed the oil markets in ways that few understand. There's nobody in industry who actually thinks that we're anywhere near running out of exploitable resources that we could put into production if the price was right. The price is wrong right now. $64 a barrel is nothing. Whenever you have these big shape-shifting moves at the presidential level, the contemporary media reporting of what's going on is almost always wrong. The U.S. is sort of losing its position as the singular global superpower. When you sit in that position for long enough, you kind of grow fat and happy. Wall Street had its way. We cored out the Midwest, steel factories and automakers, and put all those jobs overseas. And now the new arsenal of democracy is China. They make all the weapons in the world. How can we go to war with China? We don't make our own weapons. Few people can really anticipate what's coming. A tsunami of change is coming.
World War III is already happening.
This is a house of cards, and it is in the process of collapsing right now.
You're going to see an economic crash, the likes of which we've never seen.
Hey folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel we have back once again Chicken Little himself. You guys thought I was Chicken Little. We got Doomberg on today. They're an anonymous collective of former industry executives and consultants who publish a widely read Substack newsletter to the tune of 300,000 followers on Substack. That's crazy. And the anonymity of the Doomberg team is a deliberate choice to maintain the focus on the ideas presented rather than the individuals behind them. So that's why I'm going to be talking to a cartoon chicken today. He is not AI. It's not a bot. I know many people are going to suspect as much, but he actually showed me his real voice before the video started. So I can assure you that they are, in fact, a real person. They represent these ideas behind a widely known chicken avatar, perhaps emblematic that maybe, just maybe, the sky is currently falling. And if you look at the price of gold and the wild swings that we've seen in the last 48 hours, man, that's crazy, isn't it, Doomberg? 3,500, we touched it, and now it appears as though it's down to 3,400 again. What are your thoughts on this crazy bull run in gold?
Nate, first of all, great to be with you. Really enjoyed my last appearance. A lot of great feedback from it. Gold's been crazy. Gold's the kind of thing that I own a fair bit of, that I don't actually like it when it goes up too fast. It's usually a signal that there's a deeper issue in the global economy. Something is afoot. We own a fair bit of it, but we don't own enough of it that we could survive a great reset just based on our gold assets. It's more of like a hedge and maybe a bit of a liquidity pouch, for opportunistic buying during the middle of a crisis. But, to see gold go on a straight line from, $3,000 an ounce shortly after Liberation Day all the way up to 3,500 in the span of 2 weeks, that's actually not healthy. And we see that in the stock market. We see that in the oil market after the strange move by OPEC, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Broadly speaking, Trump is rewriting global trade, for better or worse. He is a force of personality, a whirlwind politically. The tariff strategy has been fascinating to watch. And gold is really doing what gold is, I guess, supposed to do, which is act as a safe haven. But it does, I think, signal potential significant reordering of international trade, perhaps gold reasserting itself as a neutral reserve asset, diminished role of U.S. Treasuries in that regard. Very hard to model all the puts and takes and the flows. We're just seeing so much history being written so quickly. I know you've done a great job trying to cover it. You've got wars, you've got gold flying, you've got oil dropping, you've got the dollar dropping, you've got judges interfering with Trump at every opportunity. You have elections in Canada, you have canceled elections in Europe. It really is just an amazing time to be in the content creation space covering geopolitics as we are.
Last night, gold went up to 3,500, and people are speculating that the Chinese are buying physical. And in New York and in London, they're actually selling paper. What are your thoughts on that? Is there a divide between East and West when it comes to gold?
We have a more speculative theory, back to a couple of days after Liberation Day, which I think shocked the markets, you would have to say. OPEC came out and had this weird announcement where they were pulling forward their increases in production, and it crushed the price of oil. And we wrote quite speculatively that perhaps there's a grand deal that has been made. We had Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the United States engaged in high-stakes diplomacy for weeks. The cover story was the war in Ukraine, and that certainly, I'm sure, was discussed. But Trump has a strong ambition for cheap oil. $50 oil is his target. When the U.S. president has such a target, they tend to have leverage to pull to get it. Who knows what deal was cut? We speculated at the time that maybe the Saudis agreed to play ball on lower oil prices in return for, the big banks letting the price of gold run. Saudi Arabia owns a lot of gold. China owns a lot of gold. There's a lot of people who would benefit from the price of gold going higher and not that many people who would be hurt by it. And so maybe that was the grand deal. Very speculative, but that's what we do. And I think it's no coincidence that since then, perhaps we've seen this massive bull run in gold. $500 move in 2 weeks is notable. I mean, it just wasn't 18 or 24 months ago where that would have been a 25% move in the price of gold, right? From 2,000 to 2,500. So we're seeing big jumps, a little bit of a pullback as we're recording. I think that's probably healthy, but something is afoot. History tells us that whenever you have these big, shape-shifting moves at the presidential level, at the major country level, the contemporary media reporting of what's going on is almost always wrong. Perhaps deliberately so. There's a lot of misdirection. Something major has been happening in the oil markets and the gold markets. The two are connected. And if gold is going to serve as a neutral reserve asset for the settlement of imbalances in international trade, the total market cap of gold probably needs to be a lot higher than it is today, which is a fancy academic way of saying that the dollar needs to be a lot weaker relative to gold. Trump wants a weaker dollar, even though he can't say it, so that he can onshore manufacturing. There's national security implications to this. We've outsourced many critical supply chains to China, as you have covered extensively on your show. And in order to get that back, we have to make it attractive for manufacturers here. And one of the classic ways you do that is you weaken the dollar. There's pressures against that. We have so much debt now, it's unclear whether it's going to work. We have to worry about interest rates and whether we can refinance that massive amount of debt. This is where Doge comes in and trying to cut government spending, which is looking like Washington is putting up its resistance. So it's a complex mosaic. I don't think you can look at gold just in isolation, or that you could look at oil just in isolation. There's big moves going on. The media almost never covers it accurately. And so we've tried to sort of speculate with some informed speculation as to what might actually be going on. And the model need not make sense. It just needs to work. We get a sense that Trump is willing to trade a high gold price for a low oil price.
Interesting. So it's my contention that resource and energy scarcity are the primary drivers of conflict. Would you agree with that, or do you have a different view of why we're seeing a flare-up geopolitically across the multiple theaters of conflict in the world? What do you think is the crux of the issue as to why nations are starting to go at it?
Well, I'd say access to resource and the fear of losing such access has been a catalyst for many geopolitical confrontations. What makes the current situation somewhat strange is the world is awash in cheap energy. The physical markets for oil and natural gas and coal are very well supplied. The energy crisis of 21-22 that started in Europe and spread to the rest of the world is over. And after every such crisis, history teaches us that a glut usually follows, and we're in the middle of a mini glut right now. Especially when you correct for inflation, like oil at $64, I could see in the chart behind you. When you correct for inflation, it's incredibly cheap. I drove into the office today and I passed by a gas station where it was less than $3 a gallon for gasoline, which is incredible given the inflationary pulse that we've all just lived through. So what makes things weird now is resource scarcity is not on anybody's radar. There's plenty of cheap energy to be had. If anything, the oil companies are squawking at Trump for putting his thumb on the scale on the downside to try to make things cheaper, to be a burst for that manufacturing renaissance that he's trying to catalyze here. So I don't know, we have a lot of tensions. I think the main driver is the U.S. is sort of losing its position as the singular global superpower. We're moving from unipolarity to multipolarity, which means different things to the U.S. than it does to, say, Russia and China. We have this war in Ukraine that hasn't gone super well for NATO. We have tensions over Taiwan. These things probably aren't directly tied to energy today. There's some deeper issues going on. And I think it's probably that transition back to a multipolar environment as opposed to energy scarcity that are driving things today.
All right, guys, so as some of you know, Canadian Prepper is a fully independent channel. We don't have sponsors and we're beholden to nobody. You can help support us by supporting yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com. I know that in an emergency, having the right gear can make all the difference. This is why I've tested and curated the best preparedness products on the market so that you can be confident and ready for whatever comes your way. Now, back to the video. So you think it's more ado with the United States losing their leverage in the global geopolitical sphere and not any longer being the preeminent power, military power, that is creating power vacuums that are being exploited by other countries who are on the come up?
Yeah, I think it's unnatural for the world to have one dominant power for a variety of reasons. When you sit in that pole position for long enough, you kind of grow fat and happy, little sloppy, little lazy, little inefficient. But also, the U.S. became sort of the police, the global police, in part because it believed it was running out of oil, this whole peak oil nonsense. And Hubbard's peak in the 70s, and U.S. oil rolled over, and suddenly we cut the deal with the Saudis where they would recycle their oil profits in the U.S. treasuries, and we would run deficits, and off we went. Now, with the shale revolution and with the Western Canada sedimentary basin, we just have this enormous deluge of practically free energy. Natural gas is free in the Permian, basically. And so the need for us to protect the sea lanes of the Middle East, it's more of a China issue than it is a U.S. issue. I think that's part of the equation. We don't need to. We're protecting everybody else's energy supplies at this point, as opposed to our own, since we're the U.S. now is like the global energy superpower. But also, I just think, look, the war in Ukraine was catastrophic for U.S. foreign interests for a variety of reasons. First and foremost, we drove Russia and China closer together. It's always been a geopolitical objective of the Atlanticists to drive a wedge between those two countries because the combination of those two countries is very formidable. You have this amazing synergy of Russia's endless supply of commodities and China's endless demand to consume them. They're sharing military technology today. Russia's army is stronger today than it was before the war in Ukraine started. And to be frank, Ukraine probably has the strongest military in Europe today just because they have, 3 years of battle testing. And technologically, nothing spurs technological development more than necessity. And they've been fighting a Slav civil war for 3 years. And battlefield tactics have evolved to the point where, Russia now has got significant experience in the field. They have the largest standing army in the world. They're very technically savvy, the Reznik missile and various other advanced drone technologies that are being tried out. I think the U.S. is behind. And the U.S. has outsourced its supply chains to China. And this, I think, explains the urgency of Trump's tariffs war. I think this is driven by the Pentagon. You could sort of model the U.S. internal civil war as one between mega Pentagon versus sort of CIA Wall Street. And Wall Street had its way for 40 or 50 years. We cored out the Midwest, steel factories and automakers, and put all those jobs overseas. And now China has got automated missile production, producing at a far faster rate than we do. They have monopoly control over many of the critical minerals that are needed to make those military supply chains work. We joked internally last year that the new arsenal of democracy is China. They make all the weapons for the Western world. How can we go to war with China? We don't make our own weapons. And so I think Trump is urgently trying to fix that. The big question is whether he has enough political capital for a long enough period of time to bridge that transition. And boy, it's going to be tight with the midterm elections coming up already just next November.
Absolutely. So going back to something that you said about the myth of peak oil. Now, we've had a lot of guests on the channel who debate, that talking point that peak oil is a myth. We've had Simon Michaud, somebody that Nate Hagen's on the channel before, and you guys had an excellent, very cordial conversation about, it was a very good exchange. I would encourage people to go and check it out. This idea that peak oil is a myth. Now, based on the most up-to-date information that I have, peak oil, I guess maybe you could explain exactly what Hubbard's theory was. I think he was talking about the bell-shaped curve that occurred in production for individual wells. But of course, that's extrapolated, to global supplies, I suppose. But what we know is that the U.S., at least the proven reserves, are around 50 billion barrels of oil. Or no, let me clarify that. 50 billion barrels of oil that can be actually harvested. And we're using 7.4 billion a year. When I say we, I'm talking about the United States and Canada. You can add 10%, I suppose. So by that metric, then, wouldn't oil, if we were just relying on our own reserves, which of course we're not, but if we were, wouldn't oil within 10 years become scarce? And what's your take on the argument by Nate Higgins that we've merely become more efficient in the extraction process? So the straw has gotten bigger, but the actual amount of supply has largely remained unchanged, in that we're having to go for the higher and higher hanging fruit. What is your take on peak oil?
All right, let me give you as quickly as I can, because the words you use are actually really important, and let me define them. You use the words proved reserve, right? So let's take a step back. The resource underground is what's there. Our view is the resource is effectively infinite relative to human consumption, both historical and projected forward. A reserve.
So what is that? What is that based on, though?
There's just so much of it. Well, let me define everything and then come back to why I believe that's true. So a reserve is just a resource against which money has been invested to prove it out. In other words, we spent money, we drilled, we measured, and we say, yes, with existing technology, we can economically bring that to the surface and burn it. If you plot 100 years, and we've done this, we've published it, I'm happy to send it to you, 100 years of U.S. production against U.S. proved reserves, it's a straight line 10 times. We're always producing 10 times our proved reserves. Proved reserves is an economic number that you have to invest in. It's regulated by the SEC, and it is not what you might think it is. That's the sleight of hand of the peak cheap oil crowd, which is, well, that's how much we have. No, that's how much of the very small subset of the giant resource that we have spent money to convert into a reserve, which is an accounting number. It's not a geologic number. Now, what's happening is every year, technology is growing exponentially. We like to say peak oil is a giant short bet on human ingenuity, and that's just a sucker's bet over time. So you tell me how much oil we produced last year, and I'll tell you that the current proven reserves are 10 times that number. It always is. It's literally R squared of 0.92. It's a straight line. And the resource base is just enormous. So we have a very small subset of our resource base that we have classified as reserves, and we're producing a small portion of that. I'll give you an example. All this talk about shale and running out. There's a giant shale in California, Monterey Shale. It's off limits. Nobody's really looked at it. When it was first discovered, there were estimates that was just an enormous, like bigger than the Permian. And then, of course, for political reasons, it's been downplayed, and we don't really want to go there. If we needed to, we'd wipe out the Gavin Newsoms of the world and break up the big blue machine that is California politics, and we'd go drill that at $300 oil because it's there. And the harder we look, the more we find.
When you say $300 oil, what do you mean by that?
In the world, let's follow through the logic of the peak oil crowd. In a world where oil is scarce, it wouldn't be trading at $64, and in inflation adjusted terms, $20 a barrel.
Unless the extraction methods were outpacing the.
But the market would sniff that out. We would know that it's coming, and the market would allocate it far more efficiently than it is now. So, but
would it in a global world though, where countries are competing and wanting to be the first to bring their oil to market, wouldn't that drive the price down, even if there was
you can look at the forward curve. You can look at the forward curves 5 years out. There's nowhere in the market anywhere is there any indication that we're running out of oil. You look at a 50-year chart of the number of ounces it takes to buy a barrel of oil, and it's outside of COVID has never been lower. This is a fallacy.
Sure, but that's really more of a reflection of the current state of things. Like how many countries are pricing in, like Saudi Arabia I mean, I'm sure they would love to price their oil higher, but they can't because the US is going to, or somebody else is going to sell it for cheaper, right?
Okay, in the world where that plays itself out, we punch it out. Everybody's rushing to sell their oil, so we're flooding the market, and that's why it's cheap. Oil would get expensive. You agree that in the end stages, oil would get expensive in that scenario, wildly so.
Well, only if you approach the limits of your ability to extract it efficiently.
The moment it became more expensive than it is, there's just an enormous glut to go find. So we come from industry. We have a lot of contacts in industry. There's nobody in industry who actually thinks that we're anywhere near running out of exploitable resources that we could convert into reserves and put into production if the price was right. The price is wrong right now. $64 a barrel is nothing. It's literally, I put out a post on Substack Notes this morning. 1 ounce of gold buys 54 barrels of oil. That's just, it used to be 10 to 20 for decades.
Is that a record?
Yeah, well, outside of COVID, when oil went negative, it skews the charts. But if you just ignore those couple of months in COVID, it's by far a record. So Argentina has a huge shale. Why aren't we producing more there? Because the rigs aren't there. We would go to these places and we would exploit. Canada has a 500 years of energy waiting to bet. And by the way, crude oil is just one slice of the hydrocarbon markets. We're growing lighter. We'll eventually all just run everything on natural gas. And there's an enormous amount of natural gas, way more natural gas than oil. The lighter you get, the more there is underground. We're switching engines. There's just, in the world where energy got scarce, prices would pop and supply would follow. There's just an enormous amount. As you said, we had a whole 30-year run of U.S. foreign policy where we had convinced ourselves we were running out of oil. There is no greater catastrophic misunderstanding of the energy markets than peak oil. And it has caused the forever wars. And here we are. The U.S. produces 20% of the world's oil, 30% of the world's natural gas. We have among the largest proved coal reserves, and we don't even mine them anymore. What a luxury. We just are sitting on a giant pile of energy. To think we're going to run out of energy, and more importantly, to invest as though we're going to run out of energy is just really a foolish thing to do in our view. And look, data's on our side. I mean, I've debated many of these peak cheap oil guys. Nate Hagen's very polite, very, very smart, a reasonably good friend. I debated Adam Rosenzweig from GNR on Adam Taggart's show. I'm happy to debate anybody. I note one of our great antagonists, Art Berman, put out a piece, basically a mea culpa, a very long piece explaining why he was wrong. There's an enormous amount of oil. Oil is not crude oil. Crude oil is a subset of oil. The definition of oil is widening, and we just have an enormous amount of hydrocarbons. We don't need crude oil because there's something special about crude oil. Crude oil is a hydrocarbon. When you burn hydrocarbons, it creates heat. We extract work from heat. You're a prepper. You understand the difference between a fossil fuel and a battery and the energy density of a can of diesel versus an EcoFlow battery setup. We'll just change the engines, Nate. We will switch the engines. We will run it on the cheapest hydrocarbons that we can find. Oil was plentiful and it's a liquid and it was easy to handle, and that's why we have jet fuel and diesel and gasoline, which are the cuts from oil that just happen to match the molecular composition of oil. We'll switch the engines. We don't have to fly our jets on jet fuel. We can fly them on other hydrocarbons. We would if price disparities grew big enough. The market is very efficient. Technology is ever evolving. Arbitrage is real. It is not. If anything, it's the opposite. It is not that the big countries are rushing to get their oil into the market while they still can. OPEC has been holding back millions of barrels a day of production. Oil is a managed market. Crude oil is a managed market. 35% of production capacity is managed by a literal cartel whose job it is to keep oil prices higher. If oil were freely trading and cartels were illegal, it would not have traded in that range between 70 and 90 for the last 3 years that we've seen.
What about the ROI on oil? Because a $50 barrel of oil, that would be sustainable maybe for existing oil wells who are already established in the United States. But what would the incentive then be, assuming that there's going to be abundant cheap oil into perpetuity, which I don't particularly agree with, but assuming that we go down to $50 a barrel, wouldn't that then put a lot of stress on the extraction of oil here in the United States where it costs a lot more. And in order for these wells to pay themselves off, I can't remember, everybody's going to give you a different figure. It's going to be dependent on where the well is put in or whatever sort of extraction method, if it's shale or, it's going to be largely dependent on, location by location. But don't we need a higher price of oil to be able to justify the costs and create the margins that are going to allow companies to be sustainable?
Not necessarily. Let me explain why. Again, first of all, not to get too fine a detail, EROI is just a derivative of peak oil. Because when you burn energy in situ to produce energy, it doesn't really matter. The energy's right there. And in fact, we've seen, for example, in the Permian Basin, that the price of natural gas can go negative. So EROI just doesn't matter. But there are now three types of energy producers in North America. This revolution in shale has actually changed the oil markets in ways that few understand. There are people or companies that only produce oil. There are companies that only produce natural gas. And then there's the new people in town, the new companies in town that produce a mixture at the same wellhead. So in the Permian, for example, you get gas, you get natural gas liquids, and you get light crude oil all from the same well. And so what their break-even price it doesn't just depend on crude oil, it depends on the price of natural gas too. So in a world where natural gas is in high demand because of AI, we're going to power our off-grid AI data centers. Natural gas goes in one side, data comes out the other. Natural gas becomes valuable. It's very clean burning. You don't have to worry about scrubbing, not much in the way of NOx, all these other issues. Suddenly, if natural gas is more valuable, then crude oil becomes the nuisance byproduct that you can just dump onto the market. And these numbers will blow your mind. Half of the current U.S. crude oil production is in association with natural gas, and 3/4 of current natural gas production is in association with crude oil. These co-producers, and when you have co-product economics, it's the price of both that you have to consider. And look, natural gas in the U.S. today, $3 a million BTU as we record this, that's the energy equivalent price of $18 a barrel oil. If natural gas goes to 4 or goes to 5, those drillers in the Permian are going to be printing cash, and they don't care what the price of oil is. And so this whole focus on crude oil as a subset of oil, as a subset of hydrocarbons, it's blurred by fungibility that most people don't recognize.
But that assumes though that the natural gas demand is going to be there to pay for whatever sort of loss is taken on oil, which, maybe hypothetically that's going to happen 10, 20 years into the future. But, is that a sure thing that a company can take to the bank?
The cleanest burning hydrocarbon is not going to trade for the lowest price forever. At $18 a barrel of oil, which would you buy to burn? You would buy natural gas. Arbitrage is very powerful.
But there's benefits to oil though, right? Like there's benefits to having the density and the ability to transport it and not needing all the infrastructure.
Sure, but the main benefit of oil is we've built all of our engines to burn it. My point is we'll switch those engines, and it doesn't take much in the way of switching for these prices to harmonize. So the break-even price for natural gas, for just pure natural gas drillers, is $2.50 a million BTU, which is the equivalent of $15 a barrel oil. So again, when you have very, very cheap energy, but you have the wrong engines, you switch the engines. Like the arbitrage is there. And this is the part that the peak oil crowd has either decided to ignore or misses in their analysis, which is crude oil is just a subset of all the hydrocarbons on the board. By the way, you can molecularly change natural gas and make jet fuel and diesel and gasoline if you want to. Chemists know how to do this. It adds some expense, but when the delta in price is wide enough, people will make that investment. This is what happens. This is the natural progression of energy prices in real terms is down over time because of human ingenuity and the fact that the resource base, not the reserves, the resource base is effectively infinite. And as we get better at AI feeds technological development.
When you say effectively infinite, though, you could probably see how that might mislead some people into...
Okay, but if we might run out in 1,000 years if we don't invent something, do you really care?
What is that actually? That's based on current known natural gas reserves, or is that just based on the speculation that there probably is more than we know there is?
Well, again, you could look at resource estimates. If you look at the resource estimate of the Western Canada Sedimentary Basin, we have enough to supply 1,000 years of supply.
And are you basing that on what is
government statistics?
What can be, because I know like with an oil well, like there can be a proven reserve of like, let's say 100 billion barrels, just theoretically, but you can only acquire a certain amount of that because of well pressure and whatnot.
No. So you just, again,
You can
proven
acquire
reserve.
every last drop as a
proven reserve is a subset of the resource. You will never get the full resource out, but by definition, if it's a proved reserve, it can come out, every drop of it. And we produce about 10% of it.
At a price point which is probably not feasible.
The definition of a proved reserve is it is viable to bring up to the ground with current technology at current prices.
Right. So this is probably where the difference between when I said that the USA has 50 billion proven barrels, that's actually derived from 1.6 trillion known
resource
amounts of oil in the ground, but only 50 is economically viable to extract.
Today, with today's technology, which is always getting better, and today's prices, which are admittedly always getting lower, and then if we run out a bit, the prices go up, and that spurs more.
There is a diminishing return there, though.
In 1,000 years, maybe, but in a 40 or a 50-year time frame that actually matters to Nate and to Doomberg and to the global economy. No, I can't stress this enough. I firmly believe that peak cheap oil is a fallacy. It's seductive, right? It makes sense. It's simple to state. Boy, we're burning a lot of oil. The Earth is a finite sphere, so we must eventually run out of it. And sure, the sun will eventually burn itself out too. I don't spend much time worried about it.
Yeah, I think it's more, I don't think anybody literally, I mean, maybe some people do, like the hardcore greenies probably, take that hardline maximalist position that, it's going to run out. But peak oil is a curve in that there's going to be oil even long after, even if we were to theoretically peak, that doesn't mean there's going to be no oil. That just means that for the next, it's going to be what Higgins calls the simplification, where you're going to have to use less and less. But this all presumes that demand stays the same and that the 6 billion or so people who use far less energy, I can't remember what the exact statistic is. Oh, yeah, I have it here. All of Africa uses 1.6 billion barrels per year versus the U.S., which uses 7.4 billion per year. So that's like 5 times the population using 1/5 the energy. So you're looking at like a 25 times energy consumption. So even if they were to increase their energy by, I don't know, by half or whatever, but by, even if they were to triple, quadruple, which would barely put them at the level of the lowest rungs of our socioeconomic ladder, they would still be putting a huge demand on the system. And I agree with you that there's a lot of natural gas. I don't think anybody disagrees with that. But to bring those systems online, I mean, that's a pretty intensive process to build all that infrastructure, to build the LNG and the... I'm not saying it can't happen, because I'm sure there was somebody back in the 1890s who said, oh, come on, you're going to put roads everywhere and there's going to be power lines going everywhere. It's impossible. It would take so much asphalt and, it's definitely possible. It's just, I think maybe some people get misguided by this idea that, well, it's infinite. If it was infinite, then we would never have to keep finding new wells. Yeah. And, so I'm a little bit more bearish or bullish, I suppose, on oil. Like, I think we're going to see much higher oil prices, but you believe the opposite. And, maybe you can just elaborate a bit more on that. And if you want, you can talk a little bit about the Art Berman fiasco, because I found the analogy interesting where he talks about beer and whiskey, and you could talk a little bit about that afterwards. But if you have anything to say with respect to what I just articulated, then go for it.
So first of all, you're absolutely right. Like 80% of the world lives on 1/10 of the Western world's energy, which actually proves one of our axioms of our analysis, which is the the demand for energy is only gated by supply. In other words, the more we produce, the more people will burn. In fact, we've coined what we call Doomberg's postulate, which states that every molecule of fossil fuel produced will be burned by somebody somewhere, and imposing local restrictions, you can't burn coal, for example, only relocates who gets to enjoy that privilege. So every pound of coal that the Western world, that Europe, that the US, that Canada has foregone has been greedily burned by China, Indonesia, Pakistan, India, because they are climbing Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Your standard of living is defined by how much energy you get to waste. You need to waste energy to impose order. And the rest of the world lives quite poorly compared to us. And so the gating function of demand is production. The more we produce, the more we'll burn. When I say infinite, I want to be I put descriptors in front of that. For modeling purposes, it is effectively infinite on time frames that matter to us. You can't project the technological development 100 years out. I mean, just look at the singularity that is AI and the pace of change that we're seeing there. So 100 years from now, who knows what technology we'll have, and burning oil and coal and natural gas will seem very rudimentary perhaps, and we will have tapped into, pick your favorite advanced, gravity bending technology. That's the stuff of Star Trek today. So in our view, what we're actually saying is we have more than enough for more than long enough to bootstrap to whatever the next solution is going to be. And humanity has an unbroken track record of finding such solutions just when they need it. And nothing spurs such development quicker than an energy shortage and a crisis. We will have shortages. Oil will go up again. The capital investment cycle of the energy industry is different than the global business cycle. And sometimes they get out of phase and we have shortages and price goes up. And then everyone screams that we're running out of oil. And then all of a sudden we get a glut again. When oil went to $147 a barrel, in 2008, I believe it was, just before the global financial crisis, Matt Simmons' book, Twilight in the Desert, calling the peak of Saudi production was all the rage. He's from Wall Street. Everyone on Wall Street read it.
Why did Saudi, just to interrupt you, sorry, why did Saudi production peak at that time?
Well, they've been holding barrels off the market. And they don't so within a year of $147, we're down to $40 again, Nate. It happens every time. Was that intentional that they were withholding even during that period of time?
OPEC
has been withholding millions of barrels a day of oil since OPEC has been a thing. They've never produced at full throttle. They have a purpose to keep oil prices high. And in fact, keeping crude oil prices high, which is really the only part of the market that they participate heavily in.
But if the demand was there, why wouldn't they
they're
just
managing the market.
More?
They're managing the market. This is why all cartels fail. Why doesn't De Beers just sell the incremental diamond? Because they want to keep the price of diamonds high. Because they make more money over the long term if they could keep the price of diamonds high, right? De Beers, sorry, plural. And all cartels exist to short the market of supply and to extract a higher price than free market economics would otherwise dictate, which is why they're illegal in the US, by the way. It's why we have anti-monopoly laws. And OPEC its very mission has caused its failure because it kept crude oil high, which led to this wave of co-producers producing both crude oil and natural gas liquids. We started switching the engines and suddenly crude oil's premium doesn't make any sense.
But if that was the case, couldn't another company come to the market? I mean, obviously there's complications with the petrodollar, but couldn't another country put cheap oil on the market to compete if it was just these cartels? I mean, they would, being a cartel, I mean, I'm sure they'd have to watch their back, but
that's exactly what the shale patch did. They went to war with the shale patch in 2014, tried to put them out of business. They had a price war. Saudi and Russia launched a price war in 2014. The price of oil crashed.
So shale is more expensive to extract?
No,
then.
Shale is, the cost to extract and the market price are two different things, right? And so because OPEC was keeping prices artificially high, a wave of drilling happened in the shale patch. Then they went on a price war and a bunch of US companies went bankrupt. But in the US, companies go to bankruptcy court and they reorganize and they emerge. The equity gets wiped out, but the wells are still there. There was, the US won that price war.
So just to clarify, you're saying, and I'm going to bring up the word that you hate, the EROI on shale is the same as it is in Saudi Arabia crude.
That's not what I said. I said
Okay.
EROI is irrelevant. It's not the same. I don't care if it's different. It just
But you're
doesn't
saying
matter.
the margins made on shale are insignificant or irrelevant compared to what the Saudis are doing with their operations.
I didn't say that either.
Okay.
There's a cost curve, but the oil cost curve is dynamic and changing because of the co-production dynamics I explained to you. And so if you could get, if the price of natural gas in the Permian went to $4 or $5 a million BTU, look out, because there'd be a rush to drill all of the wells that are known to be very gassy, that don't have much crude oil, and they would ditch the crude oil as the unwanted byproduct. The dynamics have changed, and it's forever less in the energy industry. And I use that word differently than the crude oil industry, which is itself different than the oil industry. So the break-even price on the marginal producer, in theory, is what sets the market price. But in reality, when you have co-product economics, where you're making at the very same well, natural gas liquids, and light crude, the price of crude is just but one input into your drilling decision. And if you're only producing crude and you're trying to keep that price higher, by keeping it higher, you're actually helping your competition erode your market share. So it's not as simple as what's the break-even
crude
price.
wells, are they not extracting natural gas at the same, or is shale different in that there's more natural gas there?
Shale is different in that there's more natural gas. As I said, there are three types of producers. Dry natural gas, like in Appalachia, Marcellus Shale. You have predominantly crude, traditional crude. There's just some gas. Sometimes it's flared.
Yeah.
And then you have the co-producers, especially in countries like the U.S. where you can't really flare anymore, where you have to do something. You have to collect that natural gas, and you have to collect those natural gas liquids, and you send them to Mont Belvieu. By the way, Mont Belvieu is this city, I think it's 30 miles west of or east of Houston. It has the ability to process 4 million barrels a day of natural gas liquids. And almost, I bet you nobody listening to this has ever even heard of that city. The world is trending lighter. We did a whole Doom Zoom presentation for our Pro Tier a couple of months ago called Trend Lightly. And we talked about how, the new products coming to market, the lighter products, are displacing what heavy oil used to do, which then, shoves that heavy oil back into the whole circulatory system at a lower price. We have crackers, chemical crackers in Europe running on naphtha, which is sort of heavy oils, shutting down and being replaced by ethane-only crackers in the US because we have this cheap deluge of natural gas liquids. And one of the reasons we have this deluge is because the crude oil price was too high, and it encouraged people to drill and create this glut of lighter materials. The very existence of OPEC is the cause of its fall, as with all cartels. And the definition of oil is changing. This is to Art Berman's credit in that long piece he wrote where he admitted that his thesis was incorrect. He acknowledged that the very definition of oil is changing, as we have been writing about for many years. And so, look, we come at this with no particular bias. We are analysts. We're not advocates. Our goal is to get it right. We hopefully saved our subscribers a fair bit of money by getting it right. If we thought oil was running out, believe me, it'd be better for business. I mean, it makes for much greater thumbnails and headlines and eyeball clicking and that kind of thing. But we believe the best long-term approach for our business is to try to get it right based on fundamentals as we understand them and to show our homework. And we've been proven right. Look, I remember debating 18 months ago whether shale was about to roll over. When you spend all day talking to people from industry who are telling you the realities on the ground.
Do they have a vested interest, though, in telling you certain things also?
They have a vested interest in saying oil's going to run out, right? It's quite the opposite. They're telling us that there's plenty of it, and they wish there wasn't. I have a contact. We have many contacts, as you develop a social media presence, and people reach out to you, and you become friends with them. Anytime we write about natural gas, I reach out to this person because they're a natural gas expert. They were there during the shale gas pioneer days, the early days when this was really breaking out. And we wrote a piece calling a glut in U.S. natural gas coming. And I asked them, what are your thoughts? And he goes, I don't know much about gas, but I know we have too much of it.
But
right.
Okay, how about this analogy? Back in the 90s, there was a fishery out in the cod fishing. Cod collapsed. The fishing population collapsed in eastern Canada. And individual fishermen would be of the belief that, don't worry about it. There's enough left. And so it would be in their interest then to to avoid any sort of government regulation so that they could ensure that they could continue to fish. Is there not something ado with wanting to avoid that sort of government regulation that would motivate these industry tycoons, as you say, to want to perhaps overstate the amount that's there so not to create a panic about scarcity?
I think it's the opposite. And first of all, we have way more hydrocarbons underground than we have fish in the oceans.
But it's the same. It's a finite resource, right?
Again, for modeling purposes, no. I think, yes, fish is a finite resource for modeling purposes, and we need to be very careful about our rate of extraction versus the rate of generation. Not so with hydrocarbons, which is just one of our core arguments. But no, the whole peak oil concept, we believe, is something that industry refuses to talk down because they know it's in their interest for people to think we might be running out of it and that we should treat it with some scarcity mindset. Scarcity means expensive. Expensive means profits. If the world was actually running out of oil, it wouldn't be trading at 64. It'd be trading at 300. And if we're trading at 300,
if you can do more volume at a cheaper price, though, you would make more money.
No. So this was my whole argument against the sanctions against Russia and why they were destined to fail and backfire. In the commodity world, you make all your money on price and you ruin all your profit on volume. Honestly, it's just the way it works.
So when you have those, if Louis Vuitton sold 1,000 bags, that would be better than selling 1 million bags for, just as a hypothetical.
If they doubled the amount of bags they sell now, they would lose more than 50% of their price. Yeah. So we're talking about elasticity of demand, which, to put it in sort of economics parlance. Our whole argument with the sanctions was the U.S. Navy should be escorting Russian oil tankers to make sure every drop of oil got to the markets, because that would crush the price and crush his profits. His break-even price is probably $40, $45 a barrel. If we had done that at the beginning of the Ukraine war, hauled in all the U.S. oil CEOs and said, look, we're going to give you long-term leases, but we need you to pump now. We'll help offset your losses. Let's get the price of oil down to $30 a barrel. The war would have ended a lot sooner than it did. In fact, what happened was we sanctioned Russia's volume, which spiked the price. Here's a perfect example. Let's put numbers. When oil spiked to 130 after the Ukraine war, what did Biden do? He emptied the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. 1 million barrels a day were put onto the market. That sounds like a lot, except the world consumes 100 million barrels a day.
Right.
1% extra supply crushed the price by 50%. It cut the price from 130 to 70. If we had done 2 million barrels, or if the U.S. had opened the spigots and the U.S. president, then Biden, had jawboned that we were going to bring supply online, which is what James Baker did before the first Gulf War, with Saddam Hussein. Like, we got all the oil producers together and said, you're going to produce, we're going to insulate the world from economic shock. If we had done that here, instead of trying to sanction Russia's volume, then look at $130 a barrel, Russia was making all kinds of money and feeding its war machine.
It seems that erratic pricing, though, would almost it would make it such that we can't really look at the price as a reflection of actual supply. Even during COVID, we've seen that where oil prices were negative, which is absurd, because obviously there's real value there. So is the price always reflective of I'm not sure of the economic term to describe what I'm talking about, because I'm not an economist, as you can imagine. But is that...
In the short term, no. Price can deviate substantially, especially for managed markets. Negative oil price was actually rational because COVID, the economy shut down and we ran out of places to put it. And it became prohibitively expensive to store it, so you had to pay someone to take it. But in the long term, yes, it's consistent and it's consistently down in real terms. You have these fluctuations, you have spikes, you have gluts, but in the long run, the arc of demand for energy is up and to the right, and the arc of the price of energy is down.
So let's say that none of the Russian oil refineries were hit and OPEC wasn't price fixing. What do you think the price of oil would be, and how would that impact American oil industries and Canadian oil industries that have even higher operating costs?
Our view is that the equilibrium price of oil today is around $50 a barrel.
Which isn't too far from where it is
Correct.
right now.
We're getting close to capitulation
Right.
in the oil markets.
And so what happens at $50 a barrel? Don't more people start consuming, thus driving the price up?
Sure, the cyclical nature of energy,
Jevons
and also
paradox.
sure, absolutely. By the way, absolutely correct. Paradox. And also another thing happens is a lot of belt tightening happens, and companies get more efficient, and they develop technologies, and maybe natural gas demand spikes a little bit because it's cheap and we need it for AI. And wow, I'm co-producing, so I don't really care about the price of crude at $50 when I could get $4 or $5 a million BTU for my gas. And because gas is so cheap, maybe that becomes in demand. Like all of these things they're cycles. But to sort of come back to sort of the peak oil concept, there's a view that we're going to run out of stuff. And I just think that's just an erroneous view. And history's proven it. When you plot things in 50-year timeframes, you can see the trend. It jumps out at you, right? If you plot inflation-adjusted oil, it's $20 a barrel. It's just, even in nominal terms, it's as cheap as it was 20 years ago. Forget about real terms, right? And so as we see gold skyrocketing and oil flat, what does that tell you, right? I mean, it's just, there's a lot of it. We have a lot of it, Nate. And one of the reasons I'm passionate about this is because it costs people money. Like people are betting on a resource running out, and then they buy oil, or they buy oil producers thinking that we're going to see this super spike. Spikes happen. That's part of the seductive nature of peak oil. Anytime there's a major spike, you see this parade of stories in the media about how we're running out of it, and then that's the easiest bet in the world, is just fade that spike, because 9 months later it's going to be a third of the price.
Well, I mean, I guess were it not for shale, we'd be in a different situation. And I mean, let's just take a look at this statistic here. The U.S. shale oil production is expected to peak sometime around 2027 and 2028, according to the Energy Information Administration and HSBC forecast. This peak is predicted to occur around the 10 million barrels per day mark. What do you say of that estimate?
It's just prepare to be shocked. We'll take the over. Again, you could Google peak oil production and just pick any Google date range that you want. Go back 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, 30 years, since Hubbard 50 years ago, 60 years ago. It's the same story. It's like the latest battery breakthrough story. Fade all of those. There are no battery breakthroughs in startups. Some wonder battery. If you just Google battery breakthrough and go back 20 years, 30 years, it's the same story, Nate. So no, the EIA has no idea what the technology available to the producers will be in 2027. They have some idea, I suppose, but we fade all of those. This is like it's a sucker's trade. I mean,
so is there like
so
you're basing this on, I mean, you talked about California shale. Do you have like a resource that shows all of these potential deposits?
Okay.
And what do you have a figure that differs from the 50 billion barrels a year figure that is often floated, which of course, if you look at supply, is only 5 years of supply for the entire, for the US.
It's 10 years of supply, and it's always 10 years of supply. And I have 100 data points on a single chart that says it's always 10 times what we've recently produced. I mean,
with the exception of 2008 before the shale boom.
Okay, so what happened in 2008? Oil spiked, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then shale just magically appeared. It wasn't just magic that shale appeared. Oil spiked. And it drove it literally is proving my point. I don't know what the next shale is going to be.
Well, isn't shale the end? Isn't that the source rock?
No, shale is not the end. I'll give you one example.
Well, the end in the sense that like the tar sands being, there's no bitumen after. Look, I mean, I guess there's coal or whatever.
There's a not to like open a whole other can of worms. Our understanding of geology is about as firm as our understanding of the bottom of the oceans. There's an enormous amount of hydrocarbons under the earth. How it all got there is open to debate. Lots of people say it's, quote, settled science. I happen to think that phrase is an oxymoron. I'll give you one example. Natural hydrogen wasn't on anybody's radar 10 years ago. It could be that we have an enormous amount of hydrogen underground that we could drill for. I often thought, and always thought, of hydrogen as sort of a poor carrier of energy. You had to split water to make it. It turns out water reacts with iron underground and makes hydrogen, and sometimes it gets trapped in pores in domes. And if we could drill down and get natural hydrogen, boom, there's a whole new source of energy that might make oil seem silly. And by the way, you could stimulate it. You pump steam underground and you have these iron-rich rocks, and up comes hydrogen, where the heat underground is doing the work that creates the hydrogen that allows you to bring it back to the surface. Again, all of these scarcity stories are giant short bets on human ingenuity, and all the evidence we have, both in energy and broadly, is that the pace of technological development driven by humankind is exponential. And it's very difficult for people to model exponential trends when we have our Darwinian instinct to think linearly. And so I don't think shale is going to turn over in 2027. There's already stories of people returning to old wells in the shale patch and finding that the pressures are higher than they thought they would be, and suddenly we're producing more, and maybe this is refilling. Who knows? To claim with certainty that we understand the full geology of how hydrocarbons are formed subsurface, thousands and thousands and thousands of feet below the earth, is, I think, hubris. All I can point to is the data. Every year, we consume more energy, some years a little less during economic crises, COVID, pick your favorite. It's an upward sloping curve with a bit of a sine wave on it. And the human endeavor is to push that curve up and to the right. And to bet against it has been a sucker's trade.
Sure. I mean, we've made a lot of innovations over the past 100 years, which is not to say that there won't be a diminishing return. Although I agree with you. I mean, there's so much energy on the planet in so many forms that to think that we're, in this phase of our evolution that we've exhausted all potential is probably very myopic and naive. But I guess there is an argument to be made about having not just going balls to the wall and being a bit more conservative in our appraisal just in case. But what do you say about this? So China holds an estimated 184 trillion cubic feet of proven natural gas reserves, which is a fraction of what the United States has, of course, but it's a big number. It's a lot, making it the fourth largest holder globally. This equates to about 2.6% of the world's total gas reserves. Now, China, who is an energy-starved nation and is doing everything they can to basically prepare their economy for decoupling, possibly from U.S. energy and maybe even Middle Eastern energy if, shit hits the fan there. Why aren't they leveraging natural gas if they have the industrial base in order to do it? Like if anybody can do it on a massive scale, it should be the Chinese. Why are they not exploiting that resource?
So one minor correction. China is not energy starved. They are crude oil starved. China extracts 58% of its primary energy from coal, which it is basically self-sufficient in. It still imports coal to stockpile, I think, in preparation for any hostilities with the U.S. And it also imports an enormous amount of natural gas from its neighbors via pipeline. It also imports natural gas via LNG. I'm going to make a prediction for you that at the Victory Day celebration in Moscow, that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin will announce an agreement to build the Power of Siberia 2, a giant natural gas pipeline to take gas that was going to Europe and to flow it into China. And China is building a fleet of nuclear reactors at record pace. It is still building an enormous amount of coal power production capacity. It doesn't really care about global warming. It is accountable for a huge amount of the world's CO2 emissions, while the rest of us are cutting coal consumption, which is only making it cheaper for China to consume. It does have one significant vulnerability, which is crude oil. And in order to compensate for that, it has overbuilt its refining capacity to take crude oil and make jet fuel and diesel and gasoline, which means all of China's neighbors are dependent on China for finished products. And it's in their interest that China get their oil too. So China's really executed a very good strategic energy agenda. Some would say nefariously, because it has eyes on Taiwan and it expects to confront the U.S. Navy and all of these things. but it is not energy starved. And once they get all those nuclear power plants built, it has a huge amount of hydro, by the way. It swings between coal and hydro depending on the rain. So if it's dry in Sichuan province, price of coal goes up. And if the price of coal goes up, maybe natural gas is impacted. Like all these things are interdependent and fungible. And so they are short crude oil. They import crude oil to refine, and then they export diesel and jet fuel and gasoline to all their neighbors so that they are all in it together, arms linked. If an energy crisis hurts us all, it's in your interest to make sure we don't have one. So they've actually executed a pretty shrewd policy. Now, to your question on natural gas, they are actively trying to drill for their natural gas and for shale. Their technology is a little behind. Look, the U.S. is very dynamic. The U.S. shale patch is amongst the most innovative industries on earth, and we should all be thankful that they exist and they do such great work. They make life easier for us. Same in Canada, by the way, British Columbia and Alberta. Really great stuff going on up there. And by the way, North America could be a great superpower, something I'm sure we can talk about. China's behind technologically in that area. They are investing a huge amount in advanced drilling. They're trying to drill the world's deepest hole right now, and we happen to think it's because they think there's a lot of oil and gas far below where the sort of biogenic theory of oil would say there should be. Remains to be seen. We wrote a speculative piece on that. But they are mostly energy secure with one big weakness, which is crude oil. And they don't really have much in the way of natural gas compared to Russia and the US and a few of the other large producers like Canada, for example, and Qatar, Iran. But they have great relationships with all those countries. So they run a diversified strategy. They get gas from Turkmenistan. They're, I suspect, going to build this new pipeline to Russia. They don't like to put all their eggs in one basket. The only basket they like to put a lot of eggs in is coal. It's because they have a lot of it, and you can make giant piles of it. It doesn't go bad. It sits outside, easy to store, cheap to burn.
So you think that it's not financially lucrative for them to invest in their natural gas, which is why they haven't developed that industry out, and instead it's cheaper to just import it for the time being?
Well, they don't necessarily have as much as they would need.
They allegedly have 21 times their annual consumption, which of course is,
I don't know if that's resource or reserve. I haven't looked at those numbers. So
184 trillion cubic feet, the fourth largest holder globally. Of course, China's a very large class. Proven natural gas reserves.
Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe they're holding it back, but they have the South China Sea, right? They have all manner. By the way, that's why it's a bit of a geopolitical flashpoint. There's lots of oil and gas to be had in the South China Sea. China, 58% of its energy comes from coal. That's all you really need to know. And by the way, they're more worried about energy availability than price. Price is good, but they make their money manufacturing and adding value to energy downstream. They're the world's, leading manufacturer of real stuff. But I think if they could drill for their own gas, they would. I'd have to go and see why it is that they're not drilling more.
Yeah, because you'd think if it was such a lucrative industry, as you say, it would be exploited. Maybe there's more to the technology. I find it hard to believe that the Chinese, with an average IQ of 107, don't know how to drill for natural gas. But maybe there's something like in the maybe it could even be something that's specific to their geology.
Or it could be they don't have the engines to burn it yet. They produce power with coal plants, and they're building out electric vehicles smartly in their cities to reduce gasoline demand. They are starting to switch to LNG for some of their long haul trucking, especially when the price made that an effective arbitrage. And that's also for pollution reasons. That we did a whole analysis of the Chinese energy market last year called the Year of the Dragon, China through the lens of energy, and they're pretty strategic about it. So if they're making decisions about exploiting domestic reserves versus importing from cheap neighbors versus the mix that they have versus the engines they have, it's usually one of the benefits of running a totalitarian society is you can force strategies upon your economy in ways that just don't work in more liberal democracies like we have in Canada and the US.
So maybe I'm going to put you on the spot here. Give me your estimate for where you think oil is going to be a year from now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Yeah, in today's dollars, and again, one of the big caveats
This is not
is
factoring in inflation, so I guess we're
or
speaking in
it's in today's dollars.
Yeah.
And no major war in the Middle East. Look, if we bomb Iran's nuclear facilities and they lob a bunch of missiles and take out Israel's, vulnerable power supply and its water treatment factories, all bets are off. You will see oil spike. So, like in an equilibrium world, I think the equilibrium price of oil is around $50 a barrel. That makes landed LNG at about $8 to $9 a million BTU. Natural gas in the U.S. at $4 to $5. If natural gas in the U.S. is $4 to $5, everybody in the supply chain makes money, and oil has to compete with LNG, right? I mean, if you look at LNG in Europe and Brent crude correcting for energy, they trade in lockstep now because they do the same thing. You burn them to create heat. And so equilibrium price, $50. And then I'd say every 3 to 4 years, you knock $3 to $4 off that equilibrium price. I think technology is such that in 5 years, the equilibrium price of oil will be $45 a barrel in today's currency. And then 5 years after that, 40. It's a tough business. We don't invest in E&P producers, because it's just a bad business. They're price takers. Capital intense, long cycle times, heavy government regulation, environmental concerns, brownfield obligations long after the wells are done producing. It's not a good business. I don't know why so many people are in it. But yeah, I think, the 2035 price of oil, here's my prediction. In 2035, we will be producing probably 110 million barrels a day, and all things being equal, it'll be $40 a barrel.
Okay. There's money to be made, I suppose, promoting the scarcity argument, but I mean, there's also money to be made by shorting the market as well. Is there an interest out there in shorting the oil markets that is benefiting from the opposing view?
I mean, so first of all, we don't invest in anything that we write about except for gold, and we disclose that we own a fair bit of gold. And there are two schools of thought, right? Like, you want somebody to invest in what they're writing about so they have skin in the game. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is you don't want them to be talking their book. So we would never short oil and then go write a piece that says you should short oil, because we make money by being right. And every time we publish a piece, we're betting on ourselves. And over time, our subscribers will determine whether our subscription price is value for money for them, right? But here's how I would play it, which is since physics sort of dictates that the long-term trend of the price of oil is down, but the inelasticity of demand for energy is such that when you have those artificial shortages, you see these price spikes. We think it's far better to fade those price spikes after you're pretty sure the crisis is over, but the market hasn't fully recovered yet, than to try to predict their timing. So my base case is oil is $50 next year. War breaks out in the Middle East. Oil spikes to $125. Okay, you're watching the oil market. Once oil comes back down to 100, I think you're safe to bet that oil will be 50 within 6 months. Every spike, fade the spike, don't try to time the spike. And always, unless the world's going to end, and who cares what your portfolio is, if the world's going to end, whenever you see those super spikes, they always create a glut. Natural gas in Europe traded $100 a million BTU at the peak of the Ukraine crisis. That's $600 a barrel oil. Within the calendar year, it was down 90%. Once it sort of turned from that 100 and it was trading at 70, shorting it to cover at 30 would have been an easy trade. That's our view. If you feel the impulsive need to trade commodities,
right,
Lord knows I think there's better things to trade. Wait for the spike and fade it, as opposed to try to predict it and time it.
Okay. So the difference between yours and Art Berman's argument, and I'm just, I'm an objective outsider trying to figure this out, because intuitively I'm leaning towards, commodities are something that's scarce. There's more people consuming more stuff, with the exception of oil, the price of it right now, which could be explained by a variety of things. Generally speaking, there's no doubt that, especially when measured against gold, oil is as cheap as it's ever been. For a lot of people, that would be a bullish argument for oil, but I understand your perspective. So Art Berman's perspective, maybe you could sum it up, because I think it's the only one who's really kind of pushed back at what you're saying, and in order to, try to give people a broad perspective here. So essentially, he provided the analogy of beer being natural gas and whiskey being crude oil, and conflating the two as being equivalent in terms of their capability. I know you say that you can convert natural gas to, rocket fuel, jet fuel, things of that nature. It's probably a more arduous, expensive process, but you can do it. So he compares these two things, so you can't just water it down and call it a solution. The energy cost of converting beer into whiskey is high, although you could do it. Whereas what you're saying is that we should count all natural gas liquids, NGLs, and condensates as part of the oil supply, and that doing so reveals that we're in an era of energy abundance. And you say we have a lot of whiskey, but Berman says that's not whiskey, that's beer. What is your response to that?
My response is 2 or 3 months ago, Art Berman wrote a long piece admitting that he was wrong and explaining why. And look, there's not full credit to him. I mean, I would say that I didn't appreciate.
Was that like, are you being facetious, or did he?
No, he literally put it out through his channels on his webpage. Why I'm wrong on peak cheap oil, and it was a very thoughtful, long argument. Kind of surprised us, where he basically admitted that we got the best of that argument. Didn't name us, and I have all day for Nate Hagens, right? I mean, super smart. I have all day for you. Smart, intelligent, polite, argue, debate, but keep things polite. And I'd say, if I would critique Mr. Berman, is that when we first put out our piece called Peak Cheap Oil is a Myth, he put up a whole web page, basically, effectively calling us dumb. And so we just refused to engage. Like, it's not how civil discourse should be had. And I give him full credit for writing the piece where he explained to his subscribers that he was throwing in the towel.
Was there some caveat to that, though, or was it I'm wrong and Doomberg? I mean, it was
right. No, he didn't. Well, he didn't use the word Doomberg in the piece, so I don't want to put words in his mouth.
Right.
We read it as Doomberg was right, and it's many thousands of words, and people can go find it. And it was a thoughtful piece. When there's evidence that we're running out of energy, we will be the first to write it. And again, Nate, it would be in our interest.
What was the concession there? I'm just curious.
I mean, we have an enormous amount. We're switching engines. Technology is developing. The development of a resource to a reserve is a financial decision. It's not just geology. He's a geologist. And so sometimes you focus on the thing you know the most. Mm-hmm. And in his mind, that the Hubbert's analysis proved prescient for U.S. crude oil production. And so that sleight of hand of assuming that it means all hydrocarbons will follow that. And so, again, I don't want to put words in the man's mouth, and I think it's unfair to pick on him. He's not here to defend himself, and I'm trying my best not to pick on him.
Well, I might actually interview him after this,
sure.
So I'm trying to get both perspectives and
absolutely.
Give both the space.
And I'd be all for that. Again, like I've debated many people on various topics. As long as people are civil, I could talk all day on the subject.
He's never struck me as an uncivil individual, but I'm not totally familiar with the exchanges. I do know that it seems, following him on Twitter as of late, maybe the message is a bit softer, but it's hard to kind of discern what's sarcasm and what is with some people, right?
Maybe he's being sarcastic. Maybe that whole piece that he wrote was a April Fool's joke that I just missed. I don't know. Again, I don't want to put words in his mouth. I've authentically expressed our view as a team, which is based on studying these markets for decades, having worked in the commodity sector, having a pretty good Rolodex of contacts at all the big names that you would recognize. And again, in our business, it would be much more beneficial if I could write the doomsday piece than the everything's probably going to be fine piece, right? But I we just don't believe it. And again, we came of age during an energy crisis, the European energy crisis. We chronicled that. We probably held on to that thesis too long. And like all good analysts, we had a meeting internally. Why did we hang on to that thesis too long? And what's really going on? And we've written coming up on 400 articles. We've done 40 hour-long presentations for our pro tier. We've learned all along the way. We try to get better. Our view is the world is amply supplied for the reasons I've articulated. The very price spikes that would arise from true scarcity will be the fuel for innovation that causes humanity to solve the problem. Shale was a result of the oil super spike in 2008. And I'm old enough to remember when many of the names that we've mentioned here were out in the late 2000s saying the US would never produce shale gas economically. And Marcellus Shale alone, the Marcellus Shale is like two Qatars. We can't give away natural gas in the Permian today. 21, BCF per day. It's like if the Permian were a country, it'd be a significant member of OPEC. Like it would be a top 3 or 4 member of just from like an exajoule production perspective. It's just an enormous resource that wasn't on anybody's radar. Now, it wasn't on anybody's radar in 2005. By 2015, it had changed the world. Here we are in 2025. What's going to be in 2035? I have no idea. I just know it's going to exist.
Yeah, it's. I would say that it's not even so much the resource scarcity that's the doomsday scenario. I think that there's a threshold where just game theory, where you have prices and perhaps competition for resources, as you noted, that factors into the China-Taiwan issue, probably not the primary issue by a long stretch, but even in the Middle East, that's arguably been the basis of a lot of conflicts. I think there reaches a point where, okay, maybe $69 oil doesn't justify a military incursion into a place, but $70 oil does. It doesn't take much to and so the real doomsday scenario, I think, with resource scarcity is more ado with nations competing because of the perceived scarcity component. So what you're saying is actually, bullish for that in the sense that it could potentially alleviate tensions if people were aware that there was an abundant, if they were of that belief. I'm not entirely convinced yet, but you make some very compelling arguments. But, and if that was the case, then that would reduce the tension a lot because, well, why are we fighting if there's enough to go around for everybody and we can, hold hands, sing Kumbaya and make a utopia?
Yeah, look, I think launching ATACMS missiles into, old Russia is far more likely to create a doomsday cycle than running out of oil. Mm-hmm. And I think old geopolitical tensions, let's transition from unipolar to, multipolar. That's far higher on our radar of things to worry about than running out of oil. And I think, whether we go to war with Iran or whether China makes a move on Taiwan and the world is suddenly short semiconductors, that's like real problems to worry about. I think, resolving Ukraine in a way that sort of, wars are hard to lose, of course, but resolving Ukraine in a peaceful way, avoiding war in the Middle East and settling the trade wars and coming to some kind of a détente with China over Taiwan, those are far more pressing, far more potential for doom. Those things keep me up at night. Yeah.
And I guess what I'm saying is the trigger for those things can be a very marginal degree of perceived scarcity. It doesn't have to be.
Sure.
It doesn't have. I think the running out is maybe a bit of a stretch. I don't think we're ever going to run out. I think we'll run out before we run out. But there's always going to be some. It's just a matter of who's privileged to have it. And I agree with you that human ingenuity is seemingly boundless at this point, especially with the advent of AI. Who knows what sort of nuclear fusion contraption that's going to bring about. So we'd be very short-sighted to believe that we weren't going to innovate our way out of any scarce situation as we have in the past. Nonetheless, in the run up to that, with increased amount of devastating weapons and unpredictable asymmetrical warfare, there's a risk that countries, nations perceive that scarcity as existential and go to war. How much of the current conflicts do you think with respect to the Middle East, Russia, is any of this ado with energy and access to, I mean, obviously it's geography for some of these crises, but, what is the hang up with Iran? Like, what is it? Is there I mean, I know that Europe needs Russian energy. I think that's safe to say. Maybe you have a different view of that. Israel and the United States want hegemony over that region for some reason, perhaps to ensure more energy control. I guess going back to my initial proposition to you that these wars and conflict are driven by energy scarcity, do you think that anything of what we're seeing right now is ado with that, is related to that?
Let's partition the two. I don't think the war in Ukraine is a result of anybody's fear of scarcity. And if anything else, the war in Ukraine created scarcity for Europe, which is in desperate need for Russian energy and is suffering because it no longer has access to it. So I don't think the war in Ukraine was driven by energy scarcity. It was driven by standard Cold War, old school national security concerns of Russia, perhaps not being taken too seriously by the West. All of the stuff that was going on in the Donbass from 2014 leading up to 2022, which is all well-worn territory that we don't need to cover here. The Middle East, because it was the sort of hotbed and still is a significant contributor to the energy markets, there's always been that intrigue around energy, shipping lanes, the canal, the Red Sea, the whole nine yards. All of that stuff is real. I don't know what the driving force is for the war drums with Iran. They're real. I think we should acknowledge them. I don't understand it. Wish I knew. I'm very much in the pro-peace U.S. should be isolationist camp, unabashedly so. And I think if war can be avoided with Iran, I'm all for it. I don't understand it. And when I don't understand something, I like to admit it. I don't know what our vital interest is in Iran. The cover story, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, I'm not there, I don't know, is that we're worried about them getting a nuclear bomb. I'm old enough to remember when we went to war in the Middle East over weapons of mass destruction that didn't exist. And so color me skeptical that this is the real, the cover story is what is really going on. I wish I knew, I don't know. I just know that war with Iran would be catastrophic. It would be a disaster for Trump. I think it would sink his presidency. I don't remember the last war that the U.S. got involved with that it won. One of the reasons that you don't get yourself into wars is you might lose them. And so, time will tell. Count us in the camp that unabashedly hopes for peace.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Based on your conclusions about how the oil market is manipulated, would it be in someone's vested interest to have wars to drive the price of resources up? Absolutely.
That's a plausible explanation for why, there might be some tensions in the Middle East. War is a racket, right? Is the old phrase. And especially, look, if you're in the bomb making business, peace is a working capital problem, and bombs are nothing but derivatives of energy, right? A bomb is the conveyance of an enormous amount of energy in a very small space.
Right.
Right.
It's inflationary.
155 millimeter shell has 40 kilograms of steel in it, and some explosives. Steel is a derivative of energy. We're writing on the British steel industry tomorrow. Sure, there are people who would like to see a war in the Middle East because they're long oil and a price spike would do them just fine. Which is back to our whole issue about Russian sanctions. Like, we should not be sanctioning Russia's volume. Like, you make all your money on price in this business. We want the price of oil down to hurt Russia. We did, at least in 2022. It's probably too far gone now. They've diversified their economy. They become self-sufficient, all of those things. But yeah, there's probably bad actors who would like to see a hot war in the Middle East and oil back above 100. And if there is a hot war in the Middle East, I'm the first to say that oil will probably go back above 100.
Well, arguably, Nordstream comes to mind now that you mention it, now that I prompted you to mention it. But, the U.S. has been selling a lot of LNG at exorbitant prices to Europe since the destruction of that Nord Stream pipeline. So, some people's theory is that the whole thing is about natural gas. I mean, I don't know if I believe that. I mean, obviously, it's a territorial dispute as well.
Sure. Look,
there's a lot of money to be made there.
Great whodunit, who blew up the pipelines. It's one of the great mysteries of our time, Nate. But it's pretty obvious, I think, what happened to those pipelines. I think that was a terribly dangerous precedent. I think the wanton destruction of critical energy infrastructure is a very dangerous escalation. I think what Russia's doing to the Ukraine power grid is tantamount to a war crime. And we recently wrote a piece about how China could knock out Taiwan's critical energy infrastructure in the span of minutes with, missiles that fly at Mach 10. If we've normalized the destruction of energy infrastructure that is predominantly for civilian use, Nord Stream fed the German industrial complex, for example, and when it was destroyed, Germany wasn't exactly cranking out the weapons, as Trump's lament about their military spending has proven. I think that's very dangerous. And that would be bullish for price. Look, the price of natural gas in Europe is 2 or 3 times what it was before Nord Stream was blown up, before the war broke out. Nobody would say that Europe was a winner. The US was a winner. We're selling an awful lot of LNG, as you say, at very expensive prices. And that is an outlet for Permian natural gas that allows us to drill more oil, right? When gas is the constraint. You've got a check valve, right?
There's a very interesting connection there. I never thought about that between, like you're saying, those dual wells that can produce both oil and natural gas.
Need to put it somewhere. Let's put it on a boat and sell it to Europe for a profit. I mean, it's
right.
If you're conspiratorially minded, you could imagine who might have blown up the Nord Stream pipelines. We have to be careful with one says in the age of demonetization. But
if they demonetize us, then I think for something that specific, it would somewhat prove the point.
Exactly. Whatever they say you can't say is usually true, right? But no, our main concern internally, when we saw Nord Stream destroyed, that's a deca-billion-dollar piece of infrastructure. By the way, Germany owned half of it. Whoever destroyed that pipeline attacked a NATO member, in theory, at least, right? I mean, I'm old enough to remember Biden standing right next to Olaf Scholz saying there will be no Nord Stream 2. And then months later, it's randomly destroyed by Gilligan. The crew from Gilligan's Island, apparently, is the latest cover story they're going with. So that's dangerous. I'd like to see a lot less of that. I don't know whether we will.
Fascinating the extent of vassalage with Europe and when that expiration date is going to come. And it looks like they might be finally parting ways right now, but I guess time will tell. But I think that's one point that we can agree on, that there are vested interests in ensuring that resources don't make it to market so that they can raise the price of certain things.
100%.
And this is a potential flashpoint. And I think arguably the only near term, because, when I try to play the devil's advocate with these arguments, I'm more so talking, within our lifetime as opposed to anything near term. There might be this type of scarcity, but there's too many unknowns, especially with the advent of AI. Is that something you factor into your analysis or at all, or is it too speculative at this point to say exactly how these recursive learning technologies are going to advance?
We're endlessly fascinated by this stuff, Nate, and we do a lot of private investing, and we're involved in a few startups in the space, and it's real. Look, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of fraud and there's a lot of overvalued stocks, and everybody's slapping AI onto what is sort of typical just big data crunching. But the analogy is it's sort of internet pre-bubble bursting. There's going to be some huge winners that change our lives dramatically. The technology is real. It's mind-blowing. I think there's just an enormous number of white-collar jobs that are going to be made redundant. I don't think we're ready for that. It's real. I don't know that the hype and the billions and billions and billions of dollars that are being poured into it is going to be properly invested. It almost can't be when it floods into a space at this rate. Yeah. There will be a bust. But what comes out of that is going to be game changing. And I don't know how it doesn't radically impact energy, both as a new source of demand and also as a tool to get ever more efficient at converting resources into reserves and putting reserves into production. So it feeds itself. The giant human machine that Nate likes to accurately model it, this super organism, it just absorbs more and more energy over time. What the sort of end state is, what the Kurzweilian end state is a philosophical question more than anything, I suppose. But AI is a major, real step change in technology development. We're very close to a singularity type moment, I believe. I've seen it. I believe the phrase is I've been red pilled. It's real. It's there. Few people can really anticipate what's coming. A tsunami of changes. And that can only, I think, help the energy companies get ever better at identifying resources, converting them into reserves, and bringing reserves into production. Right? That is what I see on the horizon from an energy perspective as the big impact of AI, a source of demand and a tool to meet that demand in sort of a self-fulfilling way.
It's somewhat paradoxical because on the one hand, they're going to be using immense amounts of energy. And on the other hand, the innovation gained on the basis of that energy invested could hopefully be exponentially beneficial. The linear input of energy into it, maybe there's some synergistic effect and it discovers something new. But we do know that it's going to be very energy intensive. And so this is only going to increase the demand, at least in the near term, for a lot of the fossil fuels and various existing infrastructure as we know it today. Now, the one elephant in the room here that my environmentalist viewers might take issue with is the fact that we haven't talked about the detrimental effects of conspicuous energy consumption into perpetuity on the climate. Well, what is Doomberg's take on that whole ordeal?
I think the catastrophic impacts of climate change have been vastly exaggerated. I think the very machines we're building that extract and use that energy will be used to clean up any such consequences. And even if we're wrong, China doesn't care. And so whatever we do over here is not going to bend the arc of carbon emissions anyway. If you look, the OECD countries have actually cut their emissions net in the past 20 years.
And
global
OECD?
Emissions, the developed world, the Western world, okay. Like G7, G20, Europe, South Korea, Japan, what we would call the developed world.
In fairness, they are the consuming. They're not the ones producing the stuff.
Correct. And all of those emissions have migrated to China and to India and so on. But if you just look at China's carbon emissions over time, I mean, they show no sign of abating. And you're right. So we have NIMBY'd or outsourced our production, but carbon emissions are still going up. We're going to run the experiment is my main argument. Like if putting CO2 in the atmosphere truly is the end of times, then get ready for the end of times because we're going to put the CO2 into the atmosphere. So we're going to run the experiment. We're going to find out. I once debated Professor Keene, I think his name is, and he was in the sort of catastrophe camp. And my counter to him was, if you've been saving a fine bottle of red wine, I suggest you open it because brace for impact. It's coming. We're going to emit that carbon. So let's run the experiment. I think our limited resources should be deployed against reacting to any negative consequences to climate change as they arise, as opposed to trying to control what is fundamentally a chaotic system to direct an outcome that we're not even sure is net beneficial. That's our view. There are people who have stronger views that climate change is a hoax, and there are people who have stronger views on the other side that we're literally going to boil the oceans and make human life impossible on the planet. The planet used to have far more CO2 than it does now, and it used to have much higher temperatures than it does now, and life persisted, just
prior
different
to
kinds
humans.
of life. Yeah, exactly.
Prior to modern agriculture.
But we're going to run that experiment. Nobody is going to voluntarily disarm outside of Europe, I suppose, which has done. But China, the US, India, all of these developing countries that you so correctly stated that live at 1/10 of our BTU load, right? They're going to want to climb that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? I mean, they're going to want a nicer home with natural gas cooking instead of coal or burning wood or burning dung. They're going to want higher standards of living that come from cheap energy. And who are we to tell them they can't? And there's 6-7 billion of those people who live at a fraction of what we live very, very, very good lives. And so it's going to happen. We're not going to cut carbon emissions. So I don't really spend all that much time arguing about whether or not it's going to have a bad outcome. Just prepare for that outcome and react accordingly.
I'm a realist as well, and I know that the system is not going to fundamentally change. So there really is no point in doing
Correct.
what a lot of, and some people are going to say that's fatalistic, but I just understand human nature, and I understand the nature of the machine, and the likelihood that we are going to fundamentally do something, especially when, as you aptly stated there, that many people are going to want to develop, and who's enjoying this burning of the energy and the amount of BTUs that we do? Who are we to say, well, you can't have this life because we're already there? I'm more in the camp of, okay, there's likely going to be a point of no return, which is not to say that, a lot of people will say, well, CO2 was higher for many millions of years, obviously prior to the existence of human beings. And if Elon Musk can terraform Mars, in the words of Neil deGrasse Tyson, then we can do anything on Earth, no matter what the catastrophe. If we can, if we're planning to live on a uninhabitable radioactive planet like Mars, then no matter what the state of Earth is, we should be able to innovate our way out of that situation, arguably. But I do think that, we're just at the beginning of witnessing some pretty serious changes. And I don't think we've seen the fires and a lot of that. Okay, you might be able to make the case that was anthropogenic in the direct sense in terms of arson, but the conditions have to be right for certain things. So it's a little bit of both. I think the acute effects of it probably won't present themselves immediately, but we're only a few bad seasons away from the crops. Maybe some disease, something thaws in the permafrost, and some ancient, saber-toothed tiger killing bacteria or something emerges. So there's a lot of potential scenarios that it's Pandora's box in a way. So I'm of the belief, and this is where I differ with Nate Hagens, and this is why I'm in the prepper camp. And he's all like, well, I don't really like the war wall concept, and I don't like the militancy of what you do. And it's like, that's just the reality of the world. You can't live in this, and I'm not saying that he does live in this pie in the sky, because he's a prepper himself. He has an off-grid retreat, but he takes a more idealistic, perhaps has more of an optimism bias in terms of how we can affect change in that respect. But like you, I don't see people changing. So we have to adapt to this inevitable reality, whatever may come of it. Maybe we find a way to sequester carbon and we are able to use it in a way which maybe we can use it for energy. Who knows? But on the notion of prepping, let's conclude with a brief chat about prepping. What is the big chicken, the Chicken Little, doing to prepare? And why is Doomberg, who's seemingly optimistic about the future, what is the allure to preparedness?
We're big preppers. I came to know your channel long before Doomberg was a thing. I'm a longtime subscriber, watch many of your videos. I watch some of your competitors' videos too, of course, and I put a whole Doomberg Doom Zoom presentation out called The Physics of Operating a Home, right? And it really does come down to physics, right? I mean, you have to impose order on your local environment, and starting with your body, food, water, cleanliness, medical supplies. I'm a defensive pessimist personally, which means I ponder worst case scenario risks and try to insulate myself against them. And then when they don't materialize, I don't begrudge the fact that I paid some insurance. When my house doesn't burn down, I'm not looking for a refund from, State
great.
Farm.
Yeah.
I pay my home insurance and hope it doesn't burn down. And I view my food supplies and my consumables. I sort of view my home as a factory. The product of my factory is the safety and health and happiness and well-being of my wife and children, and then my neighbors and my extended family and my region in that order. And so what comes in and what goes out? I mean, what comes in is food and electricity or other forms of energy and water and stuff from Amazon, and what goes out is garbage and sewage. And I like to model losing any of those inputs or outputs for an extended period of time. And what would you do? So I have all manner of cascading backups for various scenarios, and I've probably consumed hundreds of hours of YouTube content like yours. And it's an interesting thought experiment. It's a good hobby, and I hope to never use them. And I've had to use them a few times. We've had local emergencies and crises and extended power outages and natural disasters, and you've been able to help your friends and neighbors with some of your excess preps. Almost nobody preps, which is amazing to me. They all allow themselves to be subject to just-in-time inventory. The classic grocery store has 4 days worth of food in it. I'd like to live longer than 4 days in a grid down scenario. So I would say that I'm not a extreme preparedness person. I don't have years worth of food in my house, for example. But I have food in Mylar bags. I have, boxes and boxes of Mountain House. I have guns and bullets. I have gold coins. I have silver coins. I have enough where I could shut the doors to my home, and as long as nobody tried to break in, we could go several months. I think about water. I think about food. I think about security. I think about all those things. COVID was a trial run, exposed a lot of holes in my prepping, and I've since patched a lot of those holes. So I think it's, prudent preparedness is a hallmark of a responsible provider. I think it's okay to want to prepare for your family, and I do so with no shame.
And so what is Doombergs? What would you say that you're preparing for most? What is the worst case scenario? And we've talked a lot about the best case scenarios. What is something that is concerning you at this point that motivates you?
My biggest hole in my preparedness, I live in a relatively northern climate, and getting through the winter's hard. Look, thermal comfort is harder to achieve at the depths of winter than it is in the peak of summer, because the human sort of comfort range in that 70 degrees Fahrenheit with certain humidity profile, it's a lot easier to go from 90 to 70 than from 0 to 70. It's a bigger leap. So heating the home in the winter, my big point source of risk is if natural gas supply goes out. I could keep my furnace running with generators and solar batteries and so on, and various redundancies there. And I've trial run all of those, and I have a whole house natural gas powered backup generator and redundancies to that, like, extra oil filters and batteries to power it up. And I've run it manually, and don't just rely on the transfer switch always working, and you got to know how your stuff works and all that stuff. If I lost natural gas in the winter, which is when we'd lose it, that'd be a big hole for me. But I have a bug out cabin and a couple of years worth of quartered lumber ready to be burned if we needed to, but that would be a substantial degradation in our standard of living, and we'd be in real sort of Mad Max world if we had to go there. That's my biggest hole. There's only so much I could do. I've had subscribers reach out to say, well, you could get a propane tank installed and keep it full, but our neighborhood association probably wouldn't look too kindly on that. I live in a not a rural area, not a city either, but somewhere in between. And my neighborhood has an association and it has rules, and I can't just plop a big, white propane tank in my backyard and expect nobody to complain about it. So that's my big hole. I think about these things. Worst case scenario for me would be losing natural gas in the winter. That's actually a big one. Otherwise, I'm pretty well prepped.
I mean, there's a few options. There's wood. There's vertical heat pumps, depending on your location, how deep they would have to go. But there's a variety of options. I think wood is a more stable fuel source that, it's not as dense and it's not as efficient and convenient. But getting a wood stove, or do you have a fireplace?
No, just natural gas fired power. It's a modern home, new build. Wood burning isn't very popular where I live. I do have a cabin, off-grid cabin that has many years of corded lumber. Anytime a dead tree falls, we always sort of chop it up and split it. And it's good exercise, good to get up in nature, as you know.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of my backup there. And there are probably solutions to it. I could go for a few days. You could always, put warm clothes on and live in interior rooms. And my basement stays pretty warm in the winter because it's pretty far underground. And so that's sort of a place of last resort. But if you ask me sort of what worst case, look, grid down for months, I mean, we all have very big problems, right? I mean, I do believe in 9 meals to crazy, social disorder. I think once you get past 2 or 3 weeks, unfortunately, a lot of people would just be culled. And then, the rebirth after that is a whole different equation. I don't think very many people, your audience perhaps is an exception, could really go 2 or 3 weeks without the grid. They just don't have the resources or the skills.
Oh, no. I mean, the majority of people have no idea, especially when the further you go into the city, the less and less, unfortunately, people know.
Well, look, if you live in an apartment in New York and your sewage goes out, you can't stay in there for 2 days.
No.
Like literally.
I mean, even in summer without air conditioning.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, diesel is another thing you might want to consider. It's a fairly,
stable. Yeah.
As you know, it's not very volatile, and you can store more of it, and fairly efficient, and it's really not hard to install at all, and it's low maintenance, more convenient.
Yeah, diesel heaters are very interesting technology. I see a lot of camping YouTubers using those. It's kind of an interesting technology. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. Well, it's been great chatting with you again, and I guess we're going to have to see where we're at in a year. We're going to have to bring you back, and maybe we'll have you back before that. But, if crap hits the fan in the Middle East, then we're definitely going to have you back, because that's when we're going to be taking bets on how high the price of oil is going to go.
And when we should all short it.
Yeah, exactly, when we should short it. All right, man. Well, it's been great chatting with you, and I appreciate it. And where can people find out more?
First of all, I loved it. It's great. Always love a vigorous, and polite debate like we had, especially on peachy boil. I always learn something. You can find everything that we do at Doomberg.com, Doomberg. We write a monthly newsletter, and we also have a pro tier where we do in-depth presentations once a month. You can sign up for free. You'll get a bunch of previews, and we occasionally publish a free piece. Like the next piece we're putting out is going to be free for everybody. As you said, we have a list of 300,000 subscribers on that free list, and growing every day. Really appreciate the opportunity to come on your show. Big fan of your show, like I said, and looking forward to the next discussion.
Well, I appreciate it. It's an honor. And again, 300,000 followers on Substack. I mean, 1 million YouTube followers is an achievement. But this day and age, if you can hold people's attention with a written word, and 300,000 of them, that's a real achievement. So congratulations on that.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot for coming out. And when you do decide to do the big reveal, when you finally go mask off, I want it to be on my channel.
You will get the exclusive. But in return, then I'll be the official energy correspondent of the Canadian Prepper channel.
That'd be excellent.
All right, my friend.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.